Okay, welcome to the post-trade deadline edition of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of the VPs of Sumer Sports. I'm joined by the CEO of Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, how are you doing now that you know that which teams are buying and which teams are selling right now at the deadline?
Well, look, I mean, this has been a crazy week. We've talked a lot about it. And then you had to wake me up at 3 a.m. with a text. At least that's when I woke up, indicating that there was a firing of a head coach and a general manager across the country, which kind of has me a little bit reminiscent. Fairly similar timing, right? I mean, give or take 3 years ago in my situation. So I know Josh McDaniels, and I have Dick McDaniel, and I have appreciation for him, as well as Dave Zeigler. I mean, they're football people from the Patriot paradigm. I don't know how much we want to talk about that. I know we want to talk about deadline, but I'm just saying that's where my head is right now. It's
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because as somebody who's kind of not been in the league, right? Like I've been working in football for 7 years, but I've not had the experiences of that. I'm doing some work at like 1 a.m. and all of a sudden I see the text from the Vegas Raiders. So I'm like, is this a joke? Like, is this because it felt like not the time that this normally is done. It also felt a little bit early in the season. And it was very surprising to me. And then of course, like me, this is like the learning experience for me. Like you guys were what 0-5 when this happened in 2020, so it was like very similar. And then it was a similar situation in that both you and Dan both got let go at the same time. So I probably should not have sent that to you in the middle of the night when you're like half awake and you're like getting flashbacks of back then. So I apologize for that. I think it's a I when you think about kind of like you think about Josh McDaniel, right? And you think about his time in Denver, the time in between, and very successful in New England in between. It made sense to give him another shot, right? And I think that, if you're Mark Davis, the Patriot paradigm has not necessarily had the best luck in terms of coaches, but Josh McDaniel seemed to have a lot of characteristics of guys who had had success, right? When you think about Pete Carroll, right? Pete Carroll was the Jets head coach in 1994, the Patriots coach in 97 through 99, takes a decade and a half almost off of coaching NFL, comes back and has done really well, right? Dick Vermeil was, the Eagles coach for a long time, took a decade and some off, came back to the Rams, won a Super Bowl. There's a lot of precedent for and you think of like other coaches who have struggled, right? Like Eric Mangini had some luck with the Jets, got fired, got the Cleveland Browns job immediately after, and it wasn't as successful. I do think that I don't fault the Raiders for giving Josh McDaniel a chance because I do think that there's precedent for somebody who has struggled in the past. Even Bill Belichick, right, the best coach of all time, 1991 through 95 with Cleveland. He had those stints where I was talking to Sean on the ride in, where like he was like the head coach of the Jets twice without coaching a game, but he had like a half a decade between him being a head coach in the NFL, and that obviously worked really well. So there's like precedent for that, and so I think a lot of people are saying, "Oh, this is a huge flub by Mark Davis," and I'm like, I get it. I actually get like giving him a shot, and in some cases, sometimes it makes sense to move off quickly when you know it's not working out, and I think that both of those things are okay to say as far as how this is concerned.
There's no doubt in my mind that Mark Davis should have given him a shot, or someone else in the NFL another shot, because Josh McDaniel is, regarding offensive scheme, and he is. I hate throwing around the word genius, but he is massively adept at doing what he's doing. He knows about that. Obviously, things didn't go real well in Denver. Started off really hot. Here we are again in that situation, which is unfortunate for Josh. As far as Dave Zeigler, first time, he was in his second year, first time, he's a personnel director, gets an opportunity to come in and pair with the guy that he paired with and knew well in New England, right? They worked together.
Mm-hmm.
That's a positive, right? You don't have to learn each other's idiosyncrasies. You know each other and you can work together. So to me, it seemed like a really good let's give it a shot, right? I mean, and look, there are so many mistakes made in this league. We know it. Some work, some don't. Some people sit in that seat for 2 years, some 12, very few 20, but it happens every once in a while. But it's usually in that single digit area, right? 3, 4, 5 years, and then there's a changeover. I don't even know what the averages are right now. And by the way, you no way you should feel bad about it. I am very much over that 3 years in, although it still rubs a little bit of salt. Literally, you reached out to me at 1:00. I got up to go to the bathroom at 3:30, and that's when I saw it. That's why I was claiming you waking me up in the middle of the night. I did not go back to bed. Quite honestly, I got up and started reading as much as I could on this, and I realized again what needs to be done here. Well, and we also have to mention that Mike Lombardi's son, who we reference on here quite often, who I think is very good at what he does, his son Mick Lombardi was also released today, right? So they got rid of an offensive coordinator. Now they have Champ Kelly, who was an AGM there, is now their interim GM, and then the offensive coordinator, I believe, was a quarterback coach. I'm not really clear on who that replacement.
Yeah, so it's actually going to be Bo Hardigree, which is a little bit of an upset from what people thought, which was Scott Turner, right? Scott Turner had been the offensive coordinator for the Washington Commanders for years. He had been a quarterback's coach under his dad, Norv Turner, for a long time, and had some success in the league. I actually quite like Scott Turner as far as some of the ways in which he manipulates offense, but that's not going to be how they go. The other thing, so you bring up like a really good point about like kind of, the thing with Josh McDaniel that I think is tough, and has happened in both of his stints, is expectations were out of line, right? So you think all the way back to 2009, and this, you're probably going to think I'm a huge loser for remembering this, but in week 1 of 2009, the Broncos were playing the Cincinnati Bengals at home. And Kyle Orton, who, remember, when Josh got in there, he pissed off Jay Cutler because he beat around the bush on Matt Castle, right? So they traded Cutler to the Bears, got Orton back. Orton starting, he throws like an 80-yard touchdown on a tip ball to Brandon Stokely, and they start 1-0, right? At the very end of the game. They start 6-0, right? They beat the Patriots. Josh is running around Mile High Field, slapping hands and everything. Yeah. And to me, that was like, in a lot of cases, I actually said this on a show, when you do better than expected, the fall actually happens quicker sometimes, right? So Josh starts 6-0, finish 8-8, start the next season a little bit slower. He's fired in the middle of the second year. The Raiders, now it wasn't really the fault of Josh McDaniel, but the previous year, the Raiders had one of the worst point differentials of any team that made the playoffs. So they were 10-7, but they had the point differential and the talent of a 7-10 team. So he comes in, he replaces Rich Bisaccia, and everybody's like, well, this is a playoff team. And it's like, well, let's hold off. Like, this isn't, we got to be careful about this. Derek Carr is kind of a middling guy. You bring in Adams. So they bring in Chandler Jones. Yeah. So everybody's upping the expectations for Josh McDaniel. And not to say, look, I'm not trying to make excuses, but I also am saying, like, he's somewhat of a product of misaligned expectations, in my opinion. And that is why, from my estimation, he's gotten fired quickly twice, is almost because the beginnings were too hot for him. And they weren't allowed necessarily to sort of grow as a group. And, for you guys with the Falcons, luckily, and we talked about this Monday, you guys started, I think it was 10-6 in 2008, and then stayed 9-7 the following year. And to your point, you won the last 3 games of that year. Yeah. We talked about that Monday. Go to the show. And it's like you guys were able to sort of like steady the expectation as you guys were growing there. If you guys would have started, Thomas, 10-6 and then 3-13, who knows what would have happened, right? And so I think that is something to think about insofar as, when you're trying to build a team, sometimes the random noise of things can cloud people's judgment and cause things to go the way they're not supposed to go.
So as I was daydreaming last night, when I was trying to get back to sleep, I started thinking about the connections. I started thinking about, not that I can speak on this, and I don't mean to be speaking off cuff on this, but Bill Belichick was very close with Al Davis. They used to sit at the combine together. Had a great deal of respect for him, of course, mutual respect. Obviously, Josh McDaniel has great connections with Bill Belichick. When everything was going around a couple of years ago, when they were looking to have a coach, replace the situation in, with the Raiders, how much was Bill involved in that conversation with Mark Davis, right? What brought Mark to that spot thinking this is the ideal tandem that we're going to build together, right? We have, by the way, in Sumer Sports or on Sumer Sports, in or on, what is it? In Sumer Sports?
Let's say in Sumer Sports.
I don't know if everyone knows this, but Mike Mayock actually is part of our group here, does some consultancy work with us. And we'll talk about that another time. But I find it was just one of those things that I started spinning around wondering, with all of this stuff out there, Mark Davis making a move at this time of year. And again, it happened to me, so I know it does, it happens at times. Where are his eyes right now? Some of these people want to jump, and I know it sounds premature, but they start thinking, do I get my ducks in line for my next head coach and general manager? No, I get in front of everyone else on this, or what happens? Or do they truly have plans to keep, Champ Kelly as their incoming general manager? And what will they do with their coaching situation? And again, remember, I mentioned hypothetically, again, got to be hypothetical because there are people out there sometimes don't like whether I'm hypothetical or not. So I want to be clear about this. When I said that double B, if Bill Belichick, by some reason, is no longer with New England, he will have 3, 4, and 5 chances to go to, around the league somewhere. Is this another one of those opportunities where, again, speaking out of turn here, that Mark Davis is salivating, thinking about, wow, can I imagine truly finally having the guy that I've had a great deal of respect for over many, many years? And how ironic would that be, and a little bit uncomfortable, given the fact that, there's a lot of closeness within relationships in this league, right? So anyway, I feel bad for Josh McDaniel. I really, truly do. And Dave Zeigler, because you never want someone to lose their gig, especially, what they 9-16. They were 9-16, right?
Yeah, 9-16 over 2 years. I actually think, interestingly, and again, this is part of the whole marketing and marketing yourself. And like we have this issue at Sumer where we're trying to, the 2022 Raiders were better than the 2021 Raiders. The records were different because the results of one-score games were drastically different. They lost a lot of one-score games last year. I think about the game where they were up 17-0 against Kansas City, lost that game by 1. They were up, I believe, 16-0 to the Cardinals in week 2, lost that game. They had a lot of bad luck early. They had a quarterback who played phenomenal football in 2021, played poor football in 2022. That's not necessarily Josh McDaniel's fault. It's somewhat correlated, but it's not his necessarily fault. So as with a lot of these things, it's not just one person's fault. And that is important to kind of keep in line. Go ahead.
No, to that point, and I'll go back to you. There are so many layers to when this happens, right? And what happens when you sit there and you think about the Jimmy Garoppolo decision. That is a massive decision for that organization, right? Carr moves on. There's a lot going on there, who they moved on from and who they didn't. How has, Josh McDaniel been relating to his group, right? I mean, how close is Mark Davis to his players? Is he getting feedback from the players who are complaining about the non-use, right? We saw that all over the TV today.
Well, Chandler
Exactly.
Jones goes on kind of like a, I don't want to speak ill of Chandler Jones, but like Chandler Jones has been arrested multiple times this year for actions in the community that have been, I don't know if they're mental illness driven or whatever, but like that's not great either. And that's not necessarily something that you can go with. Now, here's an interesting question, Thomas, as we close this thing up on the Raiders, because Antonio Pierce, a linebacker formerly of the Washington Commanders and the Giants, a Super Bowl champion, he's going to be the head coach. It's not a great roster. It's they're going to start Aiden O'Connell, the Purdue quarterback, this week over Garoppolo because they don't want to pay Garoppolo the money and they don't want him to be hurt.
Right.
That's where I get worried about this. If you're thinking about being a potential executive on this team, right? We being, anybody who's looking at that job, how much of an evaluation of this team are you getting? One of the reasons you would let go of a coach this time of year is to change things up and to get a better evaluation of who you have on the roster for the next group of people, right? You want to get out ahead of a lot of stuff. The thing I get concerned about is the complete opposite thing could happen, right? Which is to say what you had happen in Indianapolis last year, where you go from Frank Reich, a established, legitimate NFL coach, to Jeff Saturday, who is coming off of working at ESPN. And do you really get a good, solid evaluation of your talent for that next regime that comes in? I think that's an open question that, the Antonio Pierces of the world are really going to have to answer here in Las Vegas, because the next person's going to come in and it might, I think they could go one or two ways, Thomas. They could swing for the fence and go after somebody like Belichick, somebody with a lot of cachet. But on the other side, with the settlement that they just had with John Gruden a couple years ago, the 6-year deal that McDaniel has 4.5 years left on, they might also go a little bit on the inexpensive route and go with inexperience, because those people are a little bit more inexpensive. And I think whichever way they go, they're going to want to get a good evaluation of their players the rest of the season. And I'm a little worried, because I think a guy like Garoppolo can at least be good enough to get you an eval on your players, whereas I'm not sure Aiden O'Connell is that good yet.
All great points, and we could ruminate on this forever. So I will let you steer on.
Let's talk a little bit more about the trades then. Let's talk. Commanders send Montez Sweat to Chicago for a 2nd-round pick. They send Chase Young to the 49ers for a 3rd-round pick. In the case of both players, not a ton of money, right? It's not like Chase Young is going to cost the 49ers about $500,000 this year.
Yeah.
The rest of the way. So it's a very good move from that perspective. Sweat's a little bit more expensive at a 2nd-round pick to the Chicago Bears. When I look at the Chicago Bears, it's the same thing that we've talked about every single time we've been in the media talking about Chicago, which is this team has a ton of cap space. They have draft capital, a lot of draft capital. And what they don't have is a great roster full of players yet. And everybody's, I think, giving Ryan Poles maybe undeserved angst because he used a 2nd-round pick on Chase Claypool last year. And now he's using a 2nd-round pick on Montez Sweat, in theory, to sign him to a big deal that, in theory, he could have signed in the offseason. I look at it a little bit differently. I think you get a head start on free agency with Sweat. It costs you a 2nd-round pick, but if you can get a premium player, not a premium position player, I don't think Sweat's a premium player. I think he's good.
Yeah.
But if you can get a guy in the building who's going to rush the passer for you, when you've had basically less than 30 sacks the last 2 seasons combined, I think I don't have a real issue with the move if I'm Ryan Poles and it's not necessarily guaranteed how long I'm going to get in this job. I'm going to start to get people into the building so that we can win football games ASAP.
Yeah, and you're not competing with what's going on in free agency. You're almost guaranteed to get it done. I get it. It's a somewhat catch-22 situation, moving another 2nd-rounder. But to your point, I mean, it's a little uneasy there. Another coach was released today, right? We talked about that at Sooner here in our offices here. So there's, he's got a lot on his plate, no question about it. And unfortunately, we were also talking about the fact that President Kevin Warren was, smack dab all over national television with a really, really down look on his face. How upset is he? How much has he been talking with Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus about, what's going on with this situation? Let's make our moves now. So I'm looking at it from that side, of course, Chicago side. Do you want to look at it from Washington side as well? Because that's got its own twist of interest for me,
right?
Having been in that spot. You have Martin Mayhew, who is a 2nd-time general manager. And as you know this, rarely do general managers get a second chance. I feel bad that there's any talk or insinuation that they're going to be turning things over there across the board in Washington. Who knows if they are or not, right? Time will tell. But with each one of these moves, there was all this discussion about, what that coach and what the GM is going to do there. And Ron Rivera is a longtime coach. We talked about him before. That was his trade, right? Or not his trade. That was his move. He was behind both of those players from that standpoint. So what's going to happen with Ron? What's going to happen with Martin? How is the new owner going to perceive all of this? Who pressed that? Where did that come from? Moving two legit players. Where are we going with that?
I know Washington under new owner Josh Harris just hired Eugene Shen, who is a longtime analytics guy for the Ravens, Jacksonville Jaguars, and Miami Dolphins. Reportedly, he was part of those trades, and I think a lot of people who are kind of that analytical ilk are more willing to sell off pieces, although we'll talk about the Vikings in a second. So I think it's partially that. I also think, and this is an interesting thought discussion for us, it's like they also just had a lot of money already tied up in their defensive line, right? When you look at Jonathan Allen as a first-round pick from a long time ago, he got a contract. Daron Payne, a first-round pick from a long time ago, he got a contract. And so you go Sweat in the first round in 19, Chase Young in the first round in 2020. Like, are you really going to put $100 million per year into your defensive line when you haven't really seen results? This is a team that's one of the worst defenses in all of football from an efficiency standpoint. And here's the other part that's interesting. They kept their offense together, right? No trade of Terry McLaurin, no movement of offensive pieces. Like, basically what Washington is doing, Thomas, is they're going to get an eval on Sam Howell. If Sam Howell's good, like, their defense is not going to keep them from getting an evaluation of Sam Howell. If Sam Howell's good, they'll win some of these games, and they won't have to draft a quarterback, and they'll take another premium position player in the middle of the draft. If Sam Howell ends up not being particularly good, they'll be in the top part of the draft and get to pick a quarterback. And, when you have, this as much as anybody, when you hit on a quarterback, those other moves, whether you have 4 great defensive linemen or 2, doesn't really matter as much as that quarterback. So I think that, to me, that's what they're doing. They're getting an eval on Howell. They're selling off pieces in case Howell doesn't work. And, those pieces, like Sweat's a good player, Thomas, and you evaluate better than me. You obviously have evaluated him, but I don't put him in that like $30 million a year edge category, right? I put him in more in like the 18 to 20. And so if you're going to have to compete with him anyway, you might as well get a second-round pick in that situation. Chase Young's a little different because he's a second overall pick, but that knee, Thomas, is like, I've talked to a lot of people in the league yesterday, and they're just not considering Chase Young because his knee there's just so much uncertainty with respect to his knee.
Yeah, this comes back to the situation where there are always layers when you're making that decision as a general manager and as a head coach, right? To move D linemen, even if they are upper tier and may not be top tier, it's pretty tough to move those guys, especially after you've invested in them. There's got to be legit reasons that they're moving on. One is a knee situation, potentially. One could be from a finance standpoint. There's no way that these guys are performing up to that level. They probably already, of course, they've had their discussions with agents, the agents and their representation to make a decision. But, I mean, again, how that goes down, think about all this, everyone. Ron Rivera has been pretty animated on the sideline, right? Where does he think his world is right now? How does he get into conversations with an owner or the owner's group when an owner is like, hey, we need to, who have basketball background, right? I had this discussion the other day. It's complicated to admit to people. We had it together. I've had it on another pod as well, where you admit like, hey, we're not doing that well this year. Let's plan for next year. When you're a head coach and a general manager, that, like, I'll raise my hand, I was there, when the seat starts getting hot and you're not sure if you're going to be around, or you don't necessarily know what the situation's going to be like. And then you have the discussion like, why don't we move for next year? And you're saying, no, I want to win as many games as possible to survive. And I had that before, both with Mike Smith and Dan Quinn, right? You get into that discussion as GM and head coach. And then if your owner at all is pushing, and we don't know what the owner's been saying, but if the owner is pushing, let's think about next year, and you're wondering about what your situation is, not to beat it to death, that is those are tough decisions to make. And how much banter do you get into with your owner on that? How much do you fight him on that?
Yeah, it's so hard, right? Because Ron Rivera is certainly not coached poorly enough to get fired. Like 100%. I think he's coached, and not to say that he's been, one of the top coaches in football, but he certainly has earned the right to play out his string in Washington. However, you have to play this kind of from a human standpoint. He walks into the building and sees two of his best players are being traded, right? The thing that comes into your mind is like, okay, am I going to be around for this new era here, right? Like they're already, and I'm not like, again, I don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but from my perspective, they gave me a quarterback who's not a high-end pick. No. He's also not a veteran guy. He's somewhere in the middle. Like everything about the Commanders this year screams a bridge to somewhere else. And just from the outside. So if you're Rivera and you're Mayhew, that's the difficult thing, right? You see these things happening around you. You're part of some of them, I'm assuming, right? Mayhew, for example, in the trades, and Rivera in obviously the game plans and all that. But you don't, and this is like you said, like you can feel the seat being hot, whether that's right or wrong. The perceptions are going to be there, and it makes for a really awkward thing because I guarantee you that this team is going to be. You're going to get a better eval on your roster if you're Josh Harris / whomever is going to lead this team in the future. If Ron Rivera is the head coach, because he's a veteran head coach, he knows how to put a game plan together. He knows how to win. They're competitive in most every game, and so how do you play that out? How do you make sure that everybody is still moving towards a goal when you don't even know necessarily? Each person doesn't know if they're going to be around next year.
So another twist, as we understand it, and as we know, at least to this point, you don't know how it's played out since the new ownership has come into place. But Ron Rivera he's the big dude there. He's the decision maker there. He's got 53. Martin Mayhew is his general manager. But as we understand, Martin doesn't have 53. And he also, by the way, has a very talented personnel director there in Bill Polian's son, Chris Polian, who was the GM at one time in Indianapolis after Bill turned it over. And what I find really interesting there is there's a lot of good football people. And you can say what you want to say about their defense and their defensive coordinator. I mean, of course he knows how to coach defense. Some people argue that it's dated. And a D coordinator who has been a head coach, and if you want to comment on that.
Can I interject briefly? Jack Del Rio is the only coach who's coached more than one season in the last 2 decades that has a winning record for the Raiders.
I know.
There's. I'm not saying he's the best in the world, but yeah, I think perception of him is a little bit lower than reality, frankly.
So my point is, if Ron Rivera is in fact still holding the keys to the kingdom there, and he made that decision on 2 defensive players, man, that's a big deal. Or I'm thinking, and I'm not trying to stir it up, but I'm just putting myself in that spot. Was there a change? Sorry, Ron. Yes, you have that, but we're going to overrule here. And our assessments of this is, as such from our personnel people, our GM, and this is what we think is best for the future of the organization. I just can't wait to hear more about how this plays out there.
Yeah, I think that there was a report that came out that I don't know if I necessarily believe on its face, but it said that they were going to make the decision as to whether or not to compete or to trade off pieces by how well they did against the Eagles on Sunday, which to me feels silly on its face because they played really well against the Eagles. They had a multiple score lead at times against them. And of course they lose, but the Eagles are one of the best teams in all of football. If you were looking to just that game as to whether or not to compete, you should lean into it a little bit. And instead, of course, they took the result of it and have somewhat sold off pieces. Like I said, it's not a complete, like, again, we don't try to use the word tank, but they're not they are trying to be competitive. They're going to have a competitive offense down the stretch. So maybe they're trying to do it both ways. And I don't know. I think another team that's maybe trying to do it both ways is the Minnesota Vikings, Thomas, right? So we talked on Monday, Kirk Cousins tears his Achilles Sunday. They start the season 1-4. Justin Jefferson gets injured. It looks over for them. They put Jefferson on IR. They've won all 3 games that Justin Jefferson hasn't played. Kirk Cousins played phenomenally against the Niners, played really well against Green Bay, tears his Achilles, and now they're stuck with Danielle Hunter on an expiring contract. Harrison Smith's a little long in the tooth, but still a good player that people would value. And instead of doing any selling, they did trade Ezra Cleveland, one of their guards, to Jacksonville, but they had Dalton Reisner in that spot, so it was kind of that thing. They traded for Josh Dobbs, the former starting quarterback of the Arizona Cardinals, to come in and compete with Jaron Hall, the BYU quarterback, and Nick Mullins, who's currently on IR. So the Vikings appear to look at this thing and say, we're 4-4, easier schedule down the stretch. And when you look at the NFC teams, Thomas, let's talk about this. Eagles, Cowboys, 49ers, Lions, Seahawks. Those are the 5 teams in the NFC that I would consider are good, right? Better than an average NFL team.
Yep.
The NFC South is going to have a playoff team, so that's either going to be the Saints or the Falcons in all likelihood. So that's another. So you have 6. The NFC playoffs give you 7 teams. So now if you're Minnesota, you're competing against the loser of Atlanta, New Orleans, Green Bay, Chicago. Like, who else in the NFC is going to compete for that playoff spot? So if you're Minnesota, you're thinking we're going to get in the dance even with a backup quarterback, and it makes it a lot more complicated, right? Because in theory, if you're Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and you're a finance guy and you're trying to move off of value and assets and stuff, you would have traded Hunter and Smith, but you were presented with a situation to have a chance to compete. So it was a really awkward Tuesday, I think, for the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, it's awkward, and yet I just it's going to be really, to me, it's going to be fascinating to see where the quarterback situation truly is. To your point, sorry, I am having something pop up and it's distracting me. Am I still on?
You are still on, Thomas.
Ah, geez. Okay. Well,
I can still see you. I think let's wrap it up though with this, because I know it's been a long Wednesday and you and I have been in meetings basically all day. And when we write our book someday, we'll put a chapter in on what this was about. But it's been an interesting day. When you look at the aftermath of all this stuff and you look at the 49ers, they trade for Chase Young, a team that has lost 3 consecutive games after starting 5-0. I really like this move for San Francisco. You bring Randy Gregory and you bring Chase Young in. Absent a great quarterback, what wins in January is elite pass rush. We saw it with the Giants in the Spagnuolo years. We've seen it over and over again. Just to kind of finish the podcast, my editorialization, my favorite move of the whole trade deadline was the 49ers picking up Chase Young. They don't necessarily have to sign him. They don't necessarily have to keep him. But for the next 3 months, I think that's going to be one of the more impactful, like Von Miller 2021 type of trades to the possible Super Bowl straits of the 49ers.
Wow. That's big lauding of the 49ers. It's another big time move by them. I want to give them credit for that for sure. You know, John Lynch, of course, and Kyle Shanahan are gonna make the moves that they believe they need to make, never sitting on their hands. I do love that. I'm a big supporter of that. So I get your point. We'll see how it all plays out. They have a lot of talented defensive players on that team. I'm still concerned, you know. I mean, where are they with their offensive situation? I know it's kind of ridiculous to talk about any of this banter out there about benching Purdy, right? Is that, you know,
no,
that's ridiculous. I know, but so your point is right. They do deserve this. I would throw out to you before we go, however, because I don't want you to cut me off here at the knees on this point. Let's say, what do you think was the most disappointing non-trade? Like which one did you really want to see happen? Or what player did you want to see go somewhere to thrive somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that this was not going to happen because Tennessee won and Will Levis looked so good on Sunday. And so there's optimism there. And, you know, you and I were kind of down on this team in the last few podcasts, but like the Titans probably are viewing themselves as a contender now. But I would have loved to have seen DeAndre Hopkins go and play for Buffalo. I know Buffalo went and sent a 4th-round pick 6th-round pick, I think. I can't remember the compensation, to Green Bay for Rasul Douglas, who's a good zone corner who can play for them without Tre'Davious White. But I would have liked to seen Buffalo, who's currently leading the league in EPA per play. I know it's quietly, but they are playing pretty well, even though their record is only 5-3. I would have liked to seen Buffalo go out and get a wide receiver to complement Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen. I really would have liked to have seen that, but I can understand after DeAndre Hopkins goes for 3 touchdowns on Sunday, how the Titans wouldn't have been necessarily all that keen to trading him, especially because they're trying to get an eval on Will Levis, and it's going to be a lot harder when your wide receivers are all gone. So I understand why it happened, but I'm a little disappointed that a team like Buffalo wasn't going to revamp their offense a little bit through the trades.
I was probably looking closely to see what was going to happen with Brian Burns, right? And Carolina, and where he would go, and was it time for him to go somewhere else? What was the best approach that way? They decided not to do that, and I'm sure Scott Fitterer has a strong reason why. And of course, I think he's a heck of a football player. I really do. How much they get out of him is going to be really important. And how I just thought there were going to be more teams out there knocking on that door. They ostensibly had an offer last year, right? I mean, two
future firsts for him was the offer on the table last year, which in hindsight doesn't look like a good turn down by Scott Fitterer. But who knows? Like, we've said this a lot of times, like, if you believe in your heart that you might never actually get to use those picks, then it's a different calculus. If you're somebody who's established like you were in the middle of your tenure, you could look to the future like that. Whereas if you're a guy like, Carolina, where, you look around the league and Dave Zeigler is losing his job a year and 8 games into his tenure, it's hard to think about trading those picks. I will say this, and I'm not trying to – Thomas Brown was pretty good last week. I like what I've seen from I was going to say Stroud Young the last couple of games. They're 1-6, granted, but they're only New Orleans is 4-4. You're not that far back from that division, and we've seen Atlanta and New Orleans really struggle to really take a hold of this season. So I think if you're Carolina, you say, look, you have one of the top 5 easiest schedules in the NFL per SumerSports.com. Maybe you're just trying to win.
Maybe you are. Look, I think there were some good players out there that I thought were going to be moving, as we mentioned, and I just wanted to throw that out to you because, again, as I also mentioned on Monday, a lot of these GMs are looking more closely now because it's brought up, and because sometimes their owners knock on their office door and say, "What about A, B, and C, and X, Y, and Z in the trade market?" And you have to do your due diligence. But deep down, because you have friends in the business or these guys are your connections, are you going to trade? You're going to reach out to the guys on some of these teams. Are you trading this guy? And their response is, hell no, I'm not trading him. That came up because Ian Rappaport said it.
Yeah.
Or someone like that. So,
yeah, no doubt. Well, this has been a great discussion. I've, it's obviously somber when folks lose their job, and it's actually jarring, frankly, when it's this early in the season. So, but no one talks about the league with in my opinion, more tact and more analysis than we do at Sumer Sports. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this content. Send a review to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Thomas loves reading those, as do I. It's a little ego boost for us in the middle of the long days. This has been a great podcast. Thomas, do you have any parting words for the crowd here?
No, you're doing well. Keep on your
awesome.
roll.
Well, so for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been the Sumer Sports Show.